Today is June 29th, 2022. I'm Janine Pulman, and I am interviewing Walter Levy about his years at the Jewish Federation. So Walter, when did you start working for the Jewish Federation? In what capacity? And what was the Federation called at that time?
Well, I came to the Federation in 1956, and it was called the Jewish Welfare Federation.
And what did you do?
I was hired as administrative assistant, primarily assistant to Jack Kravitz,
And Jack's
who was
role?
the executive director.
Great. And who did you work with besides Jack? What other leaders?
You mean lay leaders in the community? Fanny Shannon, Bernie Shannon, Henry Bromberg Jr., Henry S. Miller.
Okay, all the big names. And what did you...
No, I want to think of her name. She was the head of the women's division. She was a non-practicing attorney.
I don't know. I wasn't living in Dallas then.
But
That's okay. When you think of it, you'll tell me.
yes.
And so what was your role as assistant to Jack?
Oh, well, basically whatever Jack wanted me to do. But I had major responsibility in the campaign. What was then called Operation T, telephone solicitation. I had responsibility for, in addition to fundraising, social planning, where we looked at needs in the community and tried to meet them. Very little in the area of community relations. That was primarily Jack's thing. But the women's division and the campaign and some administrative functions were my responsibility.
Were there any specific issues at that point? What were the greatest needs at that time?
Well, one of the major issues was a Jewish community center. There were many people in the community who wanted a center, and there was a group of people, including some Federation leadership, primarily the Reform group, who not only were they not interested in the center, but who were against it. And that was one of the issues. The birth of the JCC was a difficult one. We had more than one campaign to raise enough money to build the center. This is different than in relation to Golden Acres. There was very little difficulty in coming up with the funds for Golden Acres and its expansion. But with the center, we had difficulty. And it was people like Irvin Donsky, who was a major force in seeing to it that a center would be built.
And how long did you stay at the Federation at this point?
I came in 56 and I left in 1960. In 1958 I was promoted to assistant director and did that for 2 years with some enlarged and different responsibilities. And I then left trying to find federation that I could head. And I also worked as consultant to the Council of Jewish Federations, which now is called Jewish Federation of North America. And came up to the Boston Federation as a staff member. Had a very good experience there when Sal Levy and Irvin Jaffe called and said, Walter, it's time to come home. And Hilma, my wife, and I gave it serious consideration because we liked combined Jewish philanthropies in Boston. In the city, our children got a very good education. But we decided that maybe Dallas was the place to come back to. And we came back in 1968 as associate director. And in 73, Jack had retired, and I became executive director.
So what was the name of the federation when you became executive director?
Jewish Welfare Federation.
Still?
It still was the same.
Okay.
Yeah. The current name, Jewish Federation of Greater Dallas, was not so named during my tenure.
Okay. What were the highlights in terms of big projects or biggest needs in the community when you were executive director?
Well, there's one on the table. The Jewish population study. There had been no community study in Dallas since 1945.
It's quite a time.
And there were many things that people or organizations or congregations asked of Federation which we couldn't answer. We didn't know how many Jewish people we had. We didn't know much of needs of certain age groups, for example. So the board in 1971 approved that a community study be done. It was published in 1974. The reason it took so long is because of change of executive directors and the Yom Kippur War. Because during the war, everything was mobilized to help Israel. Dr. Betty Maynard of that time SMU, Associate Professor of Sociology, was the study director, and I was the coordinator. It was a major work and turned out to be very helpful in terms of knowing how many Jewish people we had, which we didn't know, and turned out about 19,000. What the needs were, what religious preferences were, how young people felt about Dallas, what were the needs of older people, congregational affiliation. You have it, we had it all in this study.
So how did you utilize that information? How did you utilize the information from the study?
How did we?
Utilize it.
Oh, okay. The utilization was, first of all, people were interested in finding out. And we had an annual meeting at which highlights of the study were given. One of the major needs that were evident was services to older people. And by that I mean not only institutional, because we had golden acres, but other needs outside of institutional care. And that probably was the first need item that we addressed.
Mm-hmm.
And it so happened that to the people who were not really that associated to any great degree with the Federation were very much interested. And that was Minnie Marcus and Stanley Marcus. And they helped fund a study.
It's nice. Were there any other coalitions or organizations or government involvement outside of the Jewish community?
Can you make yourself a little clearer?
Well, when when after speaking about or after coming together with the study, were there other organizations in the community, coalitions with non-Jewish, or was it mostly with Jewish organizations?
Yes. Well, first of all, Federation itself and two of its agencies, namely Jewish Family Service and the Community Center, were also beneficiaries of the United Fund,
Mm-hmm.
now called United Way.
Mm-hmm.
Federation no longer is, but the Jewish Family Service and Community Center were. So we worked very closely with United Way. And United Way also helped Federation in the sense that it was through the initiative of
Keep going.
Okay, I was talking about United Way. The then executive was Fred Lang, and he proposed to Jack Kravitz that the help given to immigrants, refugees coming from concentration DP camps, was not only a Jewish responsibility, but that the Federation should have a non-Jewish campaign as well. So in our annual campaign, we also, like we had Women's Division and advanced gifts and so on, we also had a Jewish component, a non-Jewish component in the campaign structure, and we raised considerable amounts of money from non-Jewish individuals and businesses, and with considerable publicity from the Dallas Times Herald and the Dallas Morning News.
Any chance you remember what the campaigns netted
No,
at
I
that
don't
time?
remember that.
Okay. All right. And in terms of national or international events that were going on during your time period, national or international events, do you remember anything at that time?
About what?
International or national events happening historically?
Well, yes, we worked, for example, resettlement of immigrants
Okay.
was the primary responsibility of Jewish Family Service. And that is through United Hire Service, which still exists, which still helps immigrants, very close relationship. It must be said that the Dallas Jewish community was in the forefront of immigrant resettlement. There was a sense of generosity and responsibility that is what we must do. And while immigrants can go to Israel, to Canada, to South America, but in the acceptance of the number of immigrants coming to Dallas, that was a priority here, and Dallas did very well in that area. Another area in which we worked closely was in the area of community relations. You know, there were always signs of friction, signs of anti-Semitism. And so there were local and national organizations. National Conference of Christians and Jews, which was then popular in Dallas. We worked closely with them. And also with ADL and American Jewish Committee. I should have said it in the reverse, because Dallas was primarily a community in which the committee was prominent. The ADL did not have an office here until later, and then they came in also.
I didn't realize that. And what kind of a response did the Dallas Jewish community have to what was happening in terms of the anti-Semitism or what?
Well, people would come to Federation and say, my child in school is taught the alphabet. My A is for Abraham, you know, J is for Jesus, things like that. There was a problem with separation of church and state. There was a problem with the recognition of Jewish holidays. Even if they were recognized, many teachers would give tests on Jewish holidays. They didn't know or they didn't want to know. So we worked with the school board, with the superintendent of schools. That was one area. There were problems at SMU. There were some faculty members who were obviously anti-Semitic. And I remember two of them particularly that we had a problem with, and their tenure was limited.
Interesting.
Does that?
Yeah. No, this is interesting for all of us to know what's gone on with anti-Semitism over the years. Were there any other issues or concerns in terms of Israel?
Well, there was one concern I'd like to mention, and that's Jewish education. Dallas had a mixed history of Jewish education. United Jewish Hebrew Schools, or whatever it was called here before my time, had gone out of existence. And Federation then became very strong in opposing any relationship between particularly funding of Jewish education. This was separate. And when we began at Federation and either to particularly to have some inroads to not only enlarge but improve Jewish education in Dallas, we had terrific opposition from the rabbis and lay leadership. This is contrary to what happened in some other communities where Jewish education had long been a beneficiary of Federation, but we made inroads. There was a man in town, Aaron Klausner, in the furniture business, and a sort of rabbi, a lay leader. I think he had a congregation in Midland or Odessa for high holidays. Aaron became chairman of what we finally achieved, the Jewish Education Committee. And gradually we made some headways, not in competition with any Jewish education program or congregation. For example, we had a continuing education program for teachers in religious schools. These were lay leaders and they were professionals. And we offered several courses taught by our own experts. The school was housed at Tiferet, Israel, and it was successful. We had good attendance. We had people teaching like Rabbi Olin and others. So that was well received, and it improved the educational system. And then I have to mention the teen tour. This is an area in which Aaron Klausner deserves a tremendous amount of credit. We started this, and he went from congregation to congregation, and it was difficult to get agreement. The Orthodox congregation were concerned about food in Israel. The Reform were concerned that, well, the boys always have to wear a yarmulke. We had no problem with the children. We had problem with the parents and with the congregations. But eventually we got it together. And in 1973, the first teen tour in Israel, to Israel, began and was active for several years. And the first leader of it was Jack Millard, who was then the educational director of Shearith Israel. And it was very successful, and there are older adults now still thinking of that teen tour and talking about it. It had to be disbanded for various reasons, and it's now reactivated and going again. The first teen tour, the Federation staff member was Ruthie Weingarten. I was the executive, and Aaron Klausner was the lay leader who worked very hard to get it going. So that was successful. The next thing in Jewish education was not a supervisory thing, but rather a resource thing, which is what Jewish Education Department is now that it is a resource to our congregations, not in a supervisory capacity, but in a resource capacity, come to for ideas, for educational material, and that's what the department does. So we have made headway, but I can tell you it was a very major problem.
Were there any other problems that you had during your tenure?
Well, fundraising, of course, is always a problem, but the Yom Kippur War almost put everything to a halt, except working in behalf of Israel, not only in raising money, but in public relations, and letting people know what the issues really are. But I can tell you of another major problem, and that's the Federation fire. The building, a Teicher building in which the Federation was housed, was gutted on a Saturday in January, I think 1973, something like that, on a Saturday. It was arson. And it was a young man who liked to see fire. And it was a miserable situation that we lost so much valuable information about Jewish and non-Jewish organizations with whom we worked, information about lay leadership. We all had to move. We were able to rescue a few things, but everybody had losses. And we had to find new housing, at least on a temporary basis. And Federation did not have just one place where it was located. I remember Jewish Family Service was in one office building. Jack Kravitz, who was then the director of the Jewish Community Foundation after he retired, he was in another building. I don't know whether the center still has the building, but the center had a camp building in which I was located with the bookkeeping staff and the women's division. So you can imagine what that was. It was a terrible, terrible situation. I'll give you an example. I needed a copy of a letter. It burned. I called the executive of the United Way, and I said, whatever his name was, do you remember I wrote you a letter at such and such a time? Could you please send me a copy of it? And this is what we had to go through. I can tell you that when the Yom Kippur War started, this was all about the same time. We had a campaign opening at Temple Shalom. We hoped that we would have 500 people coming. We didn't. We had 1,200 coming.
Wow.
The community was so concerned about situation in Israel, the dislocation of the Federation. Everyone was willing to help. And we raised more money. In the 74 and 75 campaign than we had ever raised.
Wow. What would you say was the aspect of your tenure that you were most proud of?
I really can't do one thing, but I would name the teen tour,
Mm-hmm.
the increase in funds raised, and the Jewish population study. These were major achievements, and made me very proud. I want to say that I had a very good experience
Mm-hmm.
in Dallas. I had no major relationship problems with any professional or with any leadership. Yes, we had problems. Yes, we had disagreements. But in summary, the community worked very well, and I always I felt at home here, and I was respected, and no one mistreated me.
So I would suggest then that Dallas was a cohesive community in those days. Dallas was a cohesive community in those days. Everyone worked together. Yes or no?
Yes, I would say yes, but I'd have to go back in time. The Federation was founded by Reform Jews,
Mm-hmm.
and the leadership of Federation from its founding in 1912 until 1954, every president of the Federation came from Temple Emmanuel. It was when the conservative group began to give more money, when they began to pound the table, when they wanted to be part of it, and that was made possible. Bernie Shannon, Fanny's husband, I believe I'm correct, was the first non-Reform Jew who became president. He was a member of Shearith Israel. The Orthodox played no role at that time, but that also changed. The community grew, more congregations in every respect, so you now have a much more representative leadership
Mm-hmm.
than we had at the time.
Can you think of anything else that you would like to share in terms of your tenure?
Well, the years of my executive directorship, which unfortunately were only 2 or 3 years, it was during this time that the Federation was gutted, that we had the Yom Kippur War, and that my father passed away.
Mm.
Well, this is all in 2 or 3 years. Apparently, it just caused severe health problems that forced me to resign. But here again, not only was a date set for my resignation, but Federation wanted me to continue on a part-time basis as consultant, particularly in assistance to the president, who at that time was Dr. Stanley Pearl.
Mm-hmm.
So that I worked in the office, I worked at home on an as-needed basis on call. And I did that for half a year before my total resignation became effective.
Walter, you've had quite an experience. You had quite a few difficult issues you were dealing with at that time. But here today, you're 100 years old, your memory is incredible, and we appreciate all your memories. And if there's anything else you'd like to add before we stop, I think this is a good time. Thank you, Walter.
Thank you. Glad to do it.
So, Walter, do you have any other memories you'd like to share?
Well, yes, I mentioned before several people. The non-practicing lawyer I couldn't think of, Minnie Solomonson, was head of the women's division when I came, and we worked well together. And I also want to mention Jacob Feldman. Jake Feldman was of tremendous influence in his own quiet way, probably the best solicitor funds we had in Dallas was in the family. He really didn't seek honors or being in the forefront, but he helped others, like his two sisters, Fanny Shannon and Bessie. But he himself was a great influence, and he did this also through his influence as a solicitor and as a donor. He was the major donor to Federation for many, many years. And he set an example. And that is one reason why the Federation building is named the Jacob Feldman Building.
That's great. Any other?
Yes, he also had a foundation, the Feldman Foundation, and he asked me to be consultant to the Federation, to the Feldman Foundation, and for 18 years I worked with him and with his son Robert as consultant to the Feldman Foundation.
Great, thank you. And with that, we'll end. Thanks.
Hello, today is July 12th, 2022. I am Jessica Schneider interviewing Walter Levy. Hi, Walter.
Hello, how are you?
Doing well, Walter. How are you?
Good.
Great. We are recording an addendum for his interview.
I just want to add something that I left out at my recent oral history with Janine Pulman in the area of Jewish education that happened at the Dallas Federation in the late 1960s. As people have often said, it is very difficult to become a beneficiary of the Federation, but once you're in it, it's very difficult to get out. And this is what happened in the late 1960s when Akiba Academy applied for beneficiary status in Federation. Dallas Federation had not been supporting Jewish education for many, many years. And there were many people in the community in favor of it and many people against it. Akiba applied, and in order to be even considered, Federation requires certain things. You must be in existence for, I think, 5 years. You must have a board of directors. Your books must be audited by a certified public accountant made available to Federation. And Federation had appointed a committee to study the application of Akiba Academy. Jack Kravitz was the executive director of Federation, and he felt that by appointing a chairperson of the committee who was either Orthodox or conservative, that would be a lost cause to begin with. So he saw to it that the chairman would be a Reform Jewish person. And it was Milton Tobian who was the chairman. On the committee were Reform, Orthodox, and conservative Jewish people. They studied the application. They found nothing wrong with it. Everything was appropriate. It was not a matter of money. The amount was relatively small. I think it was between $6,000 and $7,000. But the very idea of an Orthodox-oriented Jewish day school becoming a beneficiary of the Federation just did not sit well with many people in the community. But it must be said that there were many people in favor. So when the committee was ready to report, it came before a board meeting. It was the largest board meeting the Federation has had in years that I remember. People came, you might say, for the kill, for it and against it, and a third group who had not yet made up their mind. The discussion was very, very interesting. People speaking for it and against it. One of the great speakers in our community, one of the top preachers, was Rabbi Levi Roland. At that time, all pulpit rabbis were automatically members of the board of the Federation. I don't remember Olin ever come to a board meeting, but he came to this one. And he gave one of his brilliant speeches against Akiba becoming a beneficiary. And there were others. There were others speaking for it. Finally, when it came to a vote, Akiba won by a comfortable margin. I don't remember the actual score, but I do remember that they won by 8 votes. And that is how Akiba became a beneficiary in the late 1960s and has been a beneficiary ever since, receiving, of course, larger sums of money, and from the annual campaign and other Jewish schools likewise became beneficiaries. The concern there was that Federation would lose money by making Akiba a beneficiary. That was correct, but it was also true that Federation made money. There were people in the community who did not contribute to Federation because Akiba was not a beneficiary. And there were people who did not contribute because Akiba was a beneficiary. So it ironed itself out, and nobody thinks about this, talks about it anymore. Federation has become very much involved in the area of Jewish education. I had not mentioned this in my previous interview, and I wanted to bring this to the attention because it was a first and very important step taken in our community.
Thank you very much for sharing that, Walter. Is there anything else you would like to add to your interview?
Goodbye.
Goodbye.